Perhaps not well known today, two men were involved in one of the most sensational and controversial trials of the 1920s, and certainly one of the biggest of the 20th century. It was in the tense political and social climate of the immediate post-World War I period that all of this began, and it would have widespread effects. This is the story of Sacco and Vanzetti. In 1920, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were both Italian immigrants who had come to America in the same year. Both were migrant workers who worked relatively close to each other, and they were only 3 years apart in age. None of these circumstances were particularly unusual, but both were also alleged anarchists, a group that was especially detested in America at that time. World War I had permanently altered the political landscape of all of Europe, and Italy was right in the middle of it. At this time, many people became involved in radical political groups that used violence to achieve their political goals, especially poor people who had little to lose but everything to gain from such radicalism. This included many poor immigrants in the United States. These far leftist anarchists were especially angry at the wealthy capitalists, who they saw as enemies of the people. The American government started to crack down on far left groups in the late 1910s. These groups had largely opposed America's entry into World War I, and because many of them actively protested the war effort, this was seen as treasonous. But the treatment of those arrested was criticized. Police roughed up the suspects before they were thoroughly investigated, which was seen by many legal experts as a guilty before proven innocent situation. However, the public largely approved of these raids because they were seen as preventative against senseless violence. The raids really began after a series of bombings carried out by anarchist groups. The public and the government was sick of these types causing death and fear, especially because it was in their adopted country, which contributed to suspicions of certain groups of immigrants by Americans who were still basking in the patriotic fervor brought on by the war. Because many of these anarchists were Italian immigrants under the leadership of Luigi Galleani, an anti-Italian immigrant feeling began to develop. Sacco and Vanzetti's part in this story began on Main Street in the small industrial town of Braintree, Massachusetts, the same city where the founding father and second president of the US, John Adams, was born and raised. On April 15, 1920, a paymaster and his guard were on their way to deliver a payroll to a factory when they were ambushed by two armed men and fatally shot. The large sum of money was taken, and the suspects drove away in a waiting getaway car with a few more men inside. The police chief of nearby Bridgewater, Massachusetts, Michael E. Stewart, believed the murder-robbery in Braintree was connected with the robbery of a shoe factory in Bridgewater the previous December by a group of suspects believed to be Italian anarchists. Stewart then orchestrated a trap to catch two possible suspects, both known Italian anarchists. But instead of catching either of these two suspects, instead, Sacco and Vanzetti fell into the trap. But despite being the wrong men, the police found them suspicious. Both were carrying handguns when arrested, and both were caught lying to the police when questioned. After being questioned, it was found that Sacco did have an alibi for the robbery in Bridgewater, though he had coincidentally taken a day off of work on April 15th, the day of the robbery and murder in Braintree. Vanzetti, on the other hand, didn't have an alibi for either crimes. These coincidental connections were enough to charge both men with murder on May 5th, and they were indicted on September 14th. This case was significant because it gave those on the left, socialists and other progressives, evidence that the American judicial system was critically flawed, something they had already been convinced of. To understand why this is, we have to look at American society at that time. As I said before, political radicalism increased drastically during and after World War I, and most of these radicals were associated with extreme leftist politics, many of these new radicals being working class or otherwise poor. However, such politics became far more extreme than the comparatively tame socialism, shifting over to communism or even anarchism. This led to the first Red Scare in the immediate post-war period. The left was heavily involved in workers' rights and unions. During this time, there was a sharp increase in union activities, which resulted in strikes that became larger and larger, eventually leading to the first general strike in American history in 1919, significantly disrupting factory production in many cities. But far more threatening than that were the string of anarchist bombings targeting top government officials across various states. The main perpetrators in these highly publicized bombings were all Italian immigrants, which led to a stigma against all Italian or Italian-looking immigrants in America. These small-scale bombings targeting individuals only killed 2 and injured 2, but that was nothing compared with the next bombing. On September 16th, only 2 days after Sacco and Vanzetti were indicted, a wagon loaded with explosives blew up on Wall Street indiscriminately killing more than 3 dozen civilians and injuring hundreds more. It is believed that this was retaliation for the Sacco and Vanzetti case. But this would only make things worse for them. Because of what seemed like a clear connection to violent activities, it appeared to many that Sacco and Vanzetti were part of a secret terrorist organization that was capable of carrying out horrific acts. It was already believed by those on the left that the American courts treated immigrants and other minorities unfairly. Sacco and Vanzetti were essentially the poster children of what many thought was everything that was wrong in America at that time. They were immigrants, they were leftist anarchists, they were believed to have committed murder. This perfect storm did not bode well for Sacco and Vanzetti. With all this context in mind, let's continue with the case. First, Vanzetti was convicted of first-degree murder for the Bridgewater robbery, despite only really having against him circumstantial evidence and unclear witness identification. For the Braintree murders, Sacco and Vanzetti's trial began in May 1921, a full year after being charged with the murders. With the social attitude the way it was towards Italian immigrants and suspected radical anarchists, there was virtually no hope of them getting let off. The trial went deeper into the forensics of the case, though that scientific field was still in the early stages of development. One of the 4 bullets from the victims was believed by experts to have been fired from Sacco's .32 Colt handgun, but this went against multiple witness testimony that they only saw one man fire 4 shots at that particular victim, and Vanzetti's handgun could not be directly connected to the murders. However, Vanzetti didn't seem to know much about his own gun, leading prosecutors to allege that he took it from one of the victims. But there was little evidence linking Vanzetti to the crime, and virtually all of the evidence prosecutors used against Sacco were coincidental in nature, and would almost certainly not hold up in court nowadays. The case was not yet widely known at this point, but many intellectuals and those heavily involved in politics understood the importance of the trial. Their conviction was practically guaranteed given the circumstances, but it also presented a potentially divisive problem. Those sympathetic to Sacco and Vanzetti's plight believed that they were being scapegoated and would absorb all the blame for the recent terrorist activities, and the killing of 2 innocent men would do little to solve that issue. And if the case became highly publicized, it could intensify anti-immigrant prejudices among the public, possibly leading to more sham trials. But the most troubling of all was the belief that they would be found guilty of murder based almost solely on their political beliefs. On July 21, 1921, the inevitable happened. Sacco and Vanzetti were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. In the next few years, multiple pleas were made for a new trial based on the fact that new and better methods in forensics had developed, but the presiding judge, Judge Webster Thayer, denied all these requests. In 1925, an inmate awaiting trial for murder named Celestino Medeiros confessed to the Braintree murders. He was also directly connected to an Italian gang that had a habit of robbing shoe factories similar to the one in Bridgewater that Vanzetti had been convicted of. But after hearing appeals for a new trial, Judge Thayer again denied them. In addition to the prevailing mood towards racial anarchists, Judge Thayer, though being widely respected, was also known to hold prejudices towards immigrants. On these grounds, 2 appeals were made to the Supreme Court in 1926 and 1927, but it upheld Thayer's decision in both instances. Despite so much backlash from socialists and leftist intellectuals alike, the judicial system at the state and federal level was not budging, and Sacco and Vanzetti's executions were about as inevitable as their convictions had been. By now, the intellectual sphere was outraged about the unfair trial, and more average citizens had even become involved for one side or the other. There was a last-minute appeal to Massachusetts Governor Alvin T. Fuller, but that too failed, and Sacco and Vanzetti were executed by electric chair in the early hours of August 23, 1927. Neither man put up a fight. Vanzetti even shook hands with the guards. Thousands turned up to their funeral and the 2-hour-long funeral procession through Boston. It is estimated that around 200,000 people watched the procession. They had become martyrs for a system of injustice in many people's eyes, though there were still plenty who believed that they were murderers and justice had been achieved. Whatever the case, Sacco and Vanzetti were used again and again as symbols for reforming the American judicial system throughout the following decades. The story of Sacco and Vanzetti is less about their alleged crimes, but about their treatment by the legal system and the public at large. Their case was significant because it exposed the weaknesses and prejudices of the American legal and judicial systems. And one of the biggest, though at the time less controversial criticisms of the case, is Judge Thayer's refusal to grant a retrial even after being presented with important new evidence. Sacco and Vanzetti's guilt is still unknown to this day, though many new investigations have been conducted over the years. While maybe their connection to anarchism wasn't directly proven, it is highly likely that they were both connected with that movement, though not necessarily with the violence associated with it. They were, however, close with known anarchists that had carried out violent acts, and they hinted at this when in captivity, though not too loudly. Of course, some people think that both truly were innocent and used as scapegoats for the government's war on leftist radicals. Others believe that both were in fact guilty, but the actual evidence for that is still not very clear. A more nuanced conclusion is that Sacco was guilty, but Vanzetti was innocent. Virtually all who met Vanzetti in person described him as a gentle soul who would never harm anyone. And the more convincing argument is that there was less evidence connecting him to the crimes than Sacco. But again, both were likely involved with an anarchist organization. Whatever the true verdict, the case of Sacco and Vanzetti had a huge impact on society, especially calling attention to a corrupt system that targeted, or at least unfairly treated, minorities and immigrants. And this is still an issue that continues to this day. So, what do you think about Sacco and Vanzetti? Were they guilty, or innocent, or was only one of them guilty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I shed a little bit of light on the importance of this case for those who didn't already know about it. If you liked this video, or if you're interested in the 1920s, please consider subscribing to my channel for more mini documentaries like this, as well as 1920s media and pop culture. Well, that's all for now all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.